You find yourself standing in the shadowed archives of Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the marble tombs of England's most powerful monarchs. The cold stone beneath your feet has witnessed 1,000 years of royal secrets, but there's one truth that the official histories have spent centuries trying to bury. You run your fingers along the carved inscription of Edward II's tomb, and you begin to understand that some of the most ruthless, brilliant, and consequential rulers in human history shared a secret that could have destroyed them if their enemies had been brave enough to use it against them. The year is 1308, and 24-year-old Edward II has just become King of England. Within months, he's sparked a constitutional crisis that will define his reign and ultimately lead to his brutal murder. His crime refusing to hide his passionate love affair with a French knight named Piers Gaveston. But Edward wasn't an aberration. He was part of a hidden tradition of royal men who wielded absolute power while navigating the deadly intersection of desire, politics, and survival in societies that officially condemned their very existence. Tonight, we're opening the most forbidden vault in the royal archives. We're examining 7 kings whose homosexuality didn't make them weak, it made them some of the most formidable rulers in human history. Men who learned that when society tells you that your deepest nature is a sin worthy of death, your only survival options are to become either invisible or invincible. Most chose invincible. But here's what the sanitized history books won't tell you. These weren't just kings who happened to be gay. These were men whose sexuality fundamentally shaped how they understood power, loyalty, and the brutal calculus of political survival. They created some of history's most innovative military strategies, most sophisticated court cultures, and most ruthless political systems, often precisely because they knew that weakness meant not just losing a throne, but losing their lives in the most agonizing ways medieval imagination could devise. Before we examine how royal homosexuality reshaped the map of Europe, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this? I love knowing our community spans every corner of the globe, all of us drawn to those moments when official history crumbles under the weight of human truth. Welcome to the Rainbow Crown Chronicles. Let's discover what happens when the most dangerous secret becomes the source of absolute power. Royal homosexuality in medieval Europe wasn't just scandalous, it was strategically brilliant. When your personal life could literally get you burned alive, you develop political instincts that straight monarchs never needed to master. You learn to read people with supernatural precision, to identify threats before they materialize, and to neutralize enemies with surgical efficiency. Most importantly, you learn that loyalty based on shared secrets is infinitely stronger than loyalty based on mere duty. Let's start with the king who turned royal homosexuality into an art form. First, James I of England, 1566-1625, the master of coded power. James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, uniting 2 kingdoms while conducting one of history's most sophisticated same-sex relationships. His romance with George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, reads like a political thriller wrapped in a love story that reshaped British government forever. James called Buckingham "my sweet child" and wife, language so explicitly romantic that even 17th century courtiers understood exactly what was happening. But James wasn't just being reckless, he was conducting a masterclass in leveraging personal relationships for political dominance. Buckingham became James's eyes, ears, and enforcer throughout the British court system, creating an intelligence network more sophisticated than anything previous monarchs had managed. The genius was in the structure. Traditional kings relied on nobles, whose loyalty was ultimately to their own family interests. James created loyalty based on mutual vulnerability. Buckingham's power depended entirely on James's protection, while James's most intimate secret was safe only as long as Buckingham remained absolutely faithful. It was political symbiosis disguised as romance. James's letters to Buckingham reveal the strategic thinking: "I cannot content myself without sending you this present, praying God that I may have a joyful and comfortable meeting with you, and that we may make at this Christmas a new marriage ever to be kept hereafter." This wasn't just romantic language. It was coded political communication, establishing Buckingham as James's unofficial co-ruler. The results were unprecedented. James managed to navigate the religious tensions between Protestant England and Catholic Scotland, avoid major wars during a period of European chaos, and establish governmental systems that lasted for centuries. His success came directly from understanding that shared secrets create unbreakable political bonds. Next up, Edward II of England, 1284 and 1327, when love becomes revolution. If James I represents the sophisticated approach to royal homosexuality, Edward II represents what happens when passion overwhelms political calculation. His relationship with Piers Gaveston didn't just cause scandal, it triggered a constitutional revolution that fundamentally changed how English monarchy operated. Edward inherited the throne in 1307 and immediately recalled Gaveston from exile, where Edward's father had banished him specifically to break up their relationship. Within months, Edward had elevated Gaveston above every traditional noble in England, creating a new rank of power that existed solely because of their personal connection. The English nobility understood exactly what this meant. Traditional political hierarchy was being replaced by sexual favoritism. Their response was swift and brutal. In 1312, they captured Gaveston and executed him not just as a political rival, but as a symbol of the old order fighting against royal homosexuality, disrupting established power structures. Edward's reaction revealed the true political consequences of criminalizing royal homosexuality. Rather than retreating, Edward declared war on his own nobility. The next 15 years saw England torn apart by civil conflict, as Edward refused to accept that his personal life should be subordinate to political convenience. The barons who murdered Gaveston thought they were solving a problem of royal favoritism. Instead, they discovered they were fighting a king who understood that compromise meant death. Edward's sexuality hadn't made him weak, it had made him absolutely ruthless, because he knew that submission meant not just political defeat, but literal torture and execution. Edward's downfall came when he replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger and repeated the same pattern of elevating personal relationships above political wisdom. His enemies finally succeeded in deposing him in 1327, but Edward's reign had permanently changed English constitutional law by forcing the nobility to articulate legal limits on royal power. Third, Richard the Lionheart, 1157-1199. The Crusader, King's Secret Strategy. Richard I of England spent most of his reign fighting in the Holy Land, earning his nickname Coeur de Lion for his military brilliance during the Third Crusade. What the legends don't mention is that Richard's sexuality may have been his greatest strategic advantage in the complex political landscape of medieval warfare. Contemporary chroniclers noted Richard's intense relationship with Philip II of France during their joint crusade. Gerald of Wales wrote that the two kings ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy, it was a military alliance sealed through personal intimacy. Richard understood something that heterosexual crusader kings missed in a world where marriage created permanent political obligations. Homosexual relationships offered maximum flexibility. He could form intensely loyal partnerships with other male rulers without creating dynastic complications or territorial obligations that would outlast the immediate military campaign. The strategic brilliance becomes clear when you examine Richard's crusading tactics. While other Christian leaders struggled with conflicting loyalties to wives-in-laws and future inheritance claims, Richard could form temporary but absolute alliances based purely on military necessity. His relationship with Philip II allowed them to coordinate French and English forces with unprecedented efficiency. Of course, Richard also understood the dangers. When Philip II eventually turned against him, their personal history became a weapon. Philip knew Richard's secrets, understood his personality, and could predict his strategic thinking with intimate precision. The political alliance that began in shared beds ended with Philip supporting Richard's enemies and contributing to his eventual death in 1199. Richard's legacy reveals the double-edged nature of royal homosexuality. It could create unbreakable military partnerships, but it also created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Fourth, Frederick the Great of Prussia, 1712-1786, the philosopher king's hidden revolution. Frederick II of Prussia represents the ultimate evolution of royal homosexuality as political strategy. Unlike his predecessors who struggled against societies that condemned their sexuality, Frederick managed to transform his personal life into the foundation of Prussian military and cultural dominance. Frederick's approach was revolutionary. Instead of hiding his sexuality, he created a court culture where intellectual and artistic excellence mattered more than conventional masculinity. He surrounded himself with philosophers, writers, and military strategists chosen for their abilities rather than their social connections or family bloodlines. The results transformed Prussia from a minor German state into a European superpower. Frederick's lovers and close companions included some of the most brilliant minds of the 18th century: Voltaire military engineer Maurice de Saxe, and dozens of officers whose loyalty was based on merit and personal connection rather than traditional feudal obligations. Frederick's military innovations came directly from this approach. Traditional European armies were commanded by nobles whose positions depended on birthright rather than competence. Frederick's army was led by men whose careers depended entirely on their ability to serve Frederick's interests effectively. The result was military efficiency that revolutionized European warfare. But Frederick's real genius was cultural. He created the first European court where homosexuality wasn't just tolerated, it was strategically advantageous. Men who were outcasts in other societies found protection and advancement in Prussia, creating brain drain that weakened Frederick's enemies while strengthening his own military and administrative capabilities. Frederick never married and produced no children, instead channeling all his emotional and political energy into creating institutions that would outlast his lifetime. His sexuality hadn't made him weak, it had made him the most dangerous opponent European traditionalists had ever faced. 5th Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BCE, the template for royal power. While chronologically, 1st Alexander the Great deserves examination as the template that later gay kings would either follow or rebel against. Alexander's relationship with Hephaestion wasn't just personal, it was the foundation of the most successful military conquest in human history. Alexander understood that traditional monarchy was inherently limited by family obligations, territorial boundaries, and cultural prejudices. By centering his political system around a same-sex partnership, Alexander freed himself from the constraints that had limited every previous ruler. Hephaestion served as Alexander's strategic mirror, someone who could understand Alexander's thinking with perfect clarity while offering completely honest counsel without personal agenda. Traditional royal advisors were always calculating how policies might affect their own family interests. Hephaestion's interests were identical to Alexander's, creating unprecedented strategic unity. The military advantages were immediate. While other ancient armies struggled with divided loyalties and conflicting command structures, Alexander's forces were unified around the Alexander-Hephaestion partnership. Officers understood that advancement came through service to this central relationship, rather than through traditional family or tribal connections. Alexander's sexual relationships with men also solved the cultural challenges of ruling a vast, diverse empire. Rather than imposing Greek heterosexual marriage customs on conquered peoples, Alexander could adapt to local traditions while maintaining his personal autonomy. He could honor foreign customs without compromising his own political flexibility. When Hephaestion died in 323 BCE, Alexander's grief was so complete that he died within 8 months. Their partnership had been so central to Alexander's identity and strategy that he literally couldn't survive its dissolution. But their model of homosexual partnership as political foundation would influence ambitious rulers for the next 2 millennia. And finally, Ludwig II of Bavaria, 1845-1886, the Mad King's rational strategy. Ludwig II of Bavaria, known as the Mad King, represents the tragic endpoint of royal homosexuality in an era when traditional monarchy was becoming obsolete. But Ludwig's supposed madness may have been the most rational response possible to the impossible situation facing gay royalty in the 19th century. Ludwig inherited the Bavarian throne in 1864 at a time when German unification was making small kingdoms politically irrelevant. Traditional strategies for royal survival, marriage alliances, military expansion, diplomatic maneuvering were no longer viable options for rulers of minor German states. Ludwig's response was to opt out of traditional politics entirely. Instead of fighting losing battles against Prussian expansion, he channeled Bavaria's resources into creating cultural monuments that would outlast any political arrangement. Neuschwanstein Castle, the inspiration for Disney's fairy tale castles, was actually a sophisticated strategy for achieving immortality through architecture. Ludwig's sexuality was central to this strategy. By remaining unmarried and childless, he avoided the dynastic complications that were destroying other German royal families. He could focus entirely on creating cultural legacy without worrying about inheritance disputes or family obligations that might compromise his artistic vision. The famous castles that earned Ludwig his mad reputation were actually rational investments in Bavaria's cultural distinctiveness. Ludwig understood that Bavaria couldn't compete with Prussia militarily, but it could create cultural identity so distinctive that Bavarian independence would become aesthetically necessary, rather than merely politically convenient. Ludwig's mysterious death in 1886 came just as his strategy was succeeding. His castles were becoming international tourist destinations. Bavarian cultural identity was crystallizing around his architectural vision, and his refusal to marry was being reinterpreted as romantic dedication to his kingdom, rather than evidence of sexual deviance. Now we need to examine the systematic mechanisms that allowed these men to transform their sexual orientation from a fatal vulnerability into a source of absolute power. Medieval and early modern Europe had created elaborate systems for detecting, condemning, and executing homosexual behavior. Yet these kings not only survived, they thrived. How the answer lies in understanding how medieval political systems actually functioned versus how they claimed to function. Officially, Christian Europe condemned homosexuality as a sin worthy of death. Practically, Christian Europe was run by men who understood that power trumped morality in every situation that actually mattered. Royal homosexuality existed in a carefully constructed legal gray area. The same theological authorities who condemned homosexual acts in commoners would develop elaborate interpretations explaining why royal behavior fell under different moral categories. Kings weren't subject to ordinary moral standards, they were God's representatives on earth, and their actions had to be evaluated according to divine rather than human logic. This theological flexibility created what historians call the royal exception doctrine. Behavior that would be punishable by death in a peasant became evidence of divine favor in a king. The logic was circular, but politically essential kings were chosen by God, therefore their desires must serve God's purposes, therefore their sexual behavior must be part of divine plan, regardless of how it appeared to human understanding. Edward II's relationship with Gaveston illustrates this perfectly. When English nobles complained that their king was committing sodomy, church authorities responded that kings served God in mysterious ways that ordinary humans couldn't comprehend. Edward's sexuality wasn't condemned, it was reframed as evidence that God was testing England's faith by requiring them to support a monarch whose divine mission was too complex for human judgment. But legal protection was just the beginning. Royal homosexuality created intelligence networks that heterosexual monarchs couldn't match. Men whose sexuality made them vulnerable to blackmail developed supernatural abilities to detect threats, identify potential allies, and neutralize enemies before they could organize effective resistance. Gay kings lived in a world where survival required constant vigilance. They learned to read micro-expressions, decode subtle social cues, and predict human behavior with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries. These skills translated directly into political advantage. James Arthur's intelligence network was legendary throughout Europe. His ability to predict enemy actions, identify traitors within his own court, and manipulate foreign diplomats came directly from skills he'd developed to survive as a gay man in a hostile society. When your personal life requires managing complex webs of secrecy, trust, and potential betrayal, managing state secrets becomes almost trivial by comparison. Frederick the Great took this approach even further, creating the first modern intelligence service based on men whose outsider status made them completely dependent on royal protection. Frederick's spies weren't motivated by money or patriotism, they were motivated by the knowledge that Frederick's downfall would mean their own execution. This created loyalty that traditional monarchs couldn't buy at any price. Perhaps most importantly, gay kings discovered that shared vulnerability created stronger political bonds than traditional feudal obligations. Men who served gay monarchs weren't just serving a political superior, they were protecting someone whose survival depended on their absolute discretion and loyalty. This transformed the fundamental nature of royal courts. Traditional monarchy was based on hierarchical obligations. Nobles served kings because of inherited duty, religious commandment, or fear of punishment. Gay kings created courts based on mutual dependence. Courtiers served the king because their own survival was tied to his success. The psychological effects were revolutionary. Traditional royal courts were filled with ambitious men constantly calculating how to advance their own interests, potentially at their monarch's expense. Courts centered around gay kings were filled with men whose interests were perfectly aligned with royal survival because any threat to the king was automatically a threat to everyone who served him. Richard the Lionheart's crusading success came directly from this dynamic. His closest military commanders weren't just following orders, they were protecting their own survival by ensuring Richard's success. Traditional crusading armies were weakened by conflicting loyalties as various nobles pursued their own territorial ambitions. Richard's forces were unified by shared understanding that their collective survival depended on absolute military effectiveness. Royal homosexuality also became an engine for cultural innovation in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Gay kings weren't just tolerating artistic and intellectual excellence, they were actively creating it as a survival strategy. Frederick the Great's court became the intellectual center of 18th century Europe because Frederick understood that cultural superiority was more sustainable than military dominance. He attracted the best minds of his generation not through traditional patronage, but by creating the only major European court where intellectual merit mattered more than social conformity. Ludwig II's cultural strategy was even more sophisticated. By investing Bavaria's resources in architectural monuments rather than military expansion, he created permanent cultural assets that would outlast any political arrangement. His castles weren't expressions of madness, they were rational investments in cultural immortality. The pattern repeats across centuries. Gay kings consistently invested in cultural innovation, artistic excellence, and intellectual achievement at levels that exceeded their heterosexual contemporaries. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategic necessity. Men whose political legitimacy was constantly questioned needed to create alternative sources of authority based on cultural achievement rather than traditional masculine dominance. One of the most revealing aspects of royal homosexuality was how these kings handled the marriage question. Traditional monarchy required marriage for producing heirs and creating political alliances, but gay kings had to navigate marriage without compromising their true emotional lives or political strategies. The solutions were brilliant. Some, like Richard the Lionheart, married for political necessity, but spent most of their reigns away from their wives using crusading and military campaigns to avoid domestic obligations. Others, like Frederick the Great, married early to satisfy succession requirements, but then effectively ignored their wives while conducting their real emotional lives with male companions. James the Harser developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach. He treated his wife, Anne of Denmark, as a political partner, rather than a romantic spouse, while conducting his emotional life with male favorites. This created a stable royal household while allowing James to maintain his true relationships without causing constitutional crises. The most radical approach came from kings like Ludwig II, who simply refused to marry at all, accepting the end of their dynastic lines rather than compromising their personal authenticity. This wasn't weakness, it was revolutionary assertion that royal legitimacy could be based on individual excellence rather than hereditary succession. Of course, the enemies of gay kings eventually learned to weaponize homophobia as a political strategy. The most successful attacks on gay monarchs came not from direct military confrontation, but from campaigns designed to undermine their moral authority by publicizing their sexuality. Edward II's downfall came when his enemies stopped trying to defeat him militarily and started systematically destroying his reputation by spreading detailed accounts of his sexual behavior. Once his moral authority was compromised, military rebellion became politically viable in ways that had been impossible when Edward was seen as God's representative. But even this strategy had limitations. Enemies who attacked gay kings on moral grounds had to be careful not to appear to be challenging the entire concept of royal divine authority. If kings weren't above ordinary moral standards, then the entire feudal system lost its theological foundation. The most successful attacks were those that framed royal homosexuality not as sin, but as evidence that the king had been corrupted by evil advisors. This allowed enemies to oppose the king while still respecting the institution of monarchy. Edward II's enemies didn't claim he was inherently evil. They claimed he had been led astray by Gaveston and later Despenser, who were corrupting his naturally royal virtue. By the late medieval period, gay kings had developed sophisticated survival strategies that combined legal protection, intelligence superiority, cultural innovation, and psychological warfare into comprehensive political systems. These weren't just individual survival tactics, they were revolutionary approaches to monarchy that changed how political power operated in European society. The most successful gay kings were those who understood that their sexuality wasn't a weakness to be hidden, but a source of political advantage to be leveraged strategically. They created courts based on merit rather than heredity, intelligence networks based on mutual vulnerability rather than paid loyalty, and cultural achievements that provided alternative sources of legitimacy when traditional authority was challenged. The legacy of these rainbow-crowned monarchs extends far beyond medieval political intrigue. Their survival strategies became the foundation for modern approaches to political power, intelligence gathering, and cultural influence that continue to shape our world today. Every major intelligence service in the modern world operates according to principles first developed by gay kings who needed to survive in hostile societies. The understanding that shared vulnerability creates unbreakable loyalty, that outsider status provides superior observation skills, and that hidden networks are more effective than official hierarchies. These insights came directly from centuries of royal homosexual survival strategy. Frederick the Great's intelligence methods became the template for Prussian military efficiency that dominated European warfare through World War I. James Thurber's court surveillance techniques evolved into the British intelligence services that shaped global politics for 3 centuries. Even today, intelligence agencies recruit heavily from populations whose outsider status creates both motivation and skill sets that mainstream society doesn't develop. Perhaps more importantly, gay kings pioneered the understanding that cultural influence could be more powerful and more permanent than military conquest. Ludwig II's investment in architectural monuments rather than military expansion was revolutionary for its time, but it became the standard approach for small nations seeking international influence in the modern era. Today, countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Switzerland wield international influence far beyond their military capacity, precisely because they've mastered the cultural power strategies that gay kings developed out of necessity. They've learned that soft power based on cultural excellence and moral authority can be more effective than hard power based on military dominance. The most profound legacy may be in how gay kings pioneered the political strategies that we now call identity politics. They were the first rulers to understand that marginalized identities could become sources of political strength rather than weakness, that shared oppression could create stronger coalitions than shared privilege, and that cultural authenticity could provide more sustainable authority than inherited legitimacy. Modern political movements for racial equality, gender rights, and LGBTQ+ liberation all use strategic approaches that gay kings developed centuries ago. The understanding that visibility can be more powerful than invisibility, that pride can neutralize shame as a political weapon, and that cultural representation can reshape political reality. These insights came from men who learned to transform royal homosexuality from fatal vulnerability into absolute power. Many of the governmental institutions we take for granted today were actually developed by gay kings who needed alternative sources of political authority. Professional bureaucracies based on merit rather than heredity. Cultural institutions that provided alternative sources of national identity, and military structures that prioritized effectiveness over traditional masculine hierarchies. These innovations came from rulers whose sexuality forced them to find new ways to legitimize their power. The modern constitutional monarchies of Northern Europe operate according to principles that were pioneered by kings whose homosexuality required them to develop more sophisticated, less authoritarian approaches to royal power. They learned that sustainable monarchy required consent based on cultural excellence rather than fear based on military dominance. But we shouldn't romanticize this history. The gay kings who survived and thrived did so by becoming more ruthless, more manipulative, and more politically sophisticated than their heterosexual contemporaries. Their innovations in political strategy came at enormous personal cost and often caused tremendous suffering for people caught in their wake. Edward II's refusal to compromise on his sexuality plunged England into civil war. Frederick the Great's military innovations made possible the Prussian expansion that eventually led to two world wars. James I's intelligence methods became the foundation for governmental surveillance systems that continue to threaten individual privacy today. The survival strategies that allowed gay kings to transform their sexuality from weakness into strength also made them more effective at projecting power in ways that often crushed anyone who stood in their way. Their outsider status taught them to identify and eliminate threats with efficiency that traditional rulers never developed. Which brings us to the question that defines our current political moment in societies that increasingly accept homosexuality. Do we still need the survival strategies that gay kings developed, or have their methods of transforming marginalized identity into political power become so embedded in modern political culture that they now operate independently of the original necessity that created them? The answer may be that we're living through the final chapter of a story that began in medieval bedchambers. The political techniques pioneered by gay kings have become the standard operating procedures for all modern political movements, regardless of the sexual orientation of their leaders. We've all learned to use identity as a political weapon, cultural authenticity as a source of authority, and coalition building based on shared oppression as a path to power. The ultimate irony of the Rainbow Crown legacy is that gay kings may have been too successful. Their survival strategies were so effective that they become the template for all modern political power. In teaching the world how marginalized identities could be transformed into political strength, they created political systems where everyone claims to be marginalized and everyone seeks to leverage their identity for political advantage. Today's political landscape, where cultural authenticity matters more than policy expertise, where coalition building based on identity trumps coalition building based on shared interests, and where the ability to weaponize victimhood becomes the path to political dominance, is the direct descendant of strategies pioneered by medieval gay kings who had no choice but to transform their vulnerability into invincibility. Here's the final secret that even the gay kings themselves might not have understood: their real revolution wasn't in proving that homosexuality was compatible with political power. Their real revolution was in proving that political power based on authentic identity was more sustainable than political power based on inherited authority. They accidentally discovered that in a world where traditional sources of legitimacy were becoming obsolete, the ability to transform personal authenticity into cultural influence would become the most valuable political skill possible. They weren't just surviving as gay men in heterosexual societies, they were pioneering the political strategies that would eventually replace traditional monarchy entirely. The Rainbow Crown was never really about sexuality at all. It was about the discovery that modern political power would belong to whoever could most effectively transform their identity into cultural authority, their personal authenticity into collective movement, and their individual survival into institutional change. And in that sense, we're all living in kingdoms that gay kings built, whether we realize it or not. So what do you think? Were these kings political innovators who happened to be gay, or did their sexuality directly create the political intelligence that reshaped European history? And perhaps more importantly, in our current era of identity, politics, and cultural power, are we still following strategies pioneered by medieval gay kings who learned that survival required transforming vulnerability into invincibility? Let me know in the comments which of these rainbow-crowned rulers surprised you most, and what connections you see between their survival strategies and modern political movements. The past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and not all of them are as buried as the powerful would like us to believe.